Sarah Chen had always believed that hands were meant to heal, not harm. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had dedicated her life to saving others. Her small frame often fooled people into thinking she was fragile, but those who knew her understood the steel beneath her gentle exterior. The red cross patches on her uniform weren't just symbols, they were promises she made every morning when she woke up in the cramped medical tent. The forward operating base in Afghanistan's Helmand province buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Helicopters thundered overhead, their rotors cutting through the desert air like mechanical locusts. Sarah moved through the medical station with practiced efficiency, checking supplies, organizing medications, and preparing for whatever the day might bring. Her hands, steady and sure, had sutured countless wounds, administered countless doses of morphine, and held countless dying soldiers in their final moments. "Morning, Doc," called out Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, limping slightly as he approached her station. The burly man from Texas had taken shrapnel to his leg 3 weeks ago, and Sarah had been monitoring his recovery ever since. His broad grin could light up even the darkest corners of their makeshift world. "I've told you 100 times, Mike, I'm not a doctor," Sarah replied, not looking up from her inventory checklist. "I'm a combat medic." "There's a difference." "Yeah, right," Mike chuckled, settling onto the examination table. "Tell that to Johnson. You saved his life when that IED went off near Checkpoint Charlie. Far as we're concerned, you're our angel in ACUs." Sarah felt the familiar flutter of discomfort at the praise. She had joined the army to help people, to be part of something bigger than herself. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, she had watched her grandmother work as a nurse, seen how healing hands could bring comfort to suffering. The military had seemed like the perfect way to use those skills while serving her country. "How's the leg feeling?" she asked, deflecting the conversation back to medical matters. "Better every day." "You did good work, document real good work." As Mike rolled up his pant leg, Sarah examined the healing wound. Her fingers probed gently around the scar tissue, checking for signs of infection or improper healing. This was her world: sterile bandages, antiseptic, the quiet satisfaction of watching damaged flesh knit itself back together under her care. "Looks excellent," she pronounced. "Another weekend, you'll be back to full duty." "Can't wait. Sitting around here while my boys are out there doesn't feel right." Sarah understood that sentiment better than most. Every time a patrol left the base, she felt the weight of responsibility. Her job was to be ready when they came back, ready for the broken bones, the bullet wounds, the blast injuries that were becoming all too common. She had trained for this, studied field medicine and trauma care until the procedures became second nature. But no amount of training could prepare someone for the emotional toll. The radio crackled to life in the corner of the medical tent. "Medevac requested at grid reference 41 RPQ 123456. We have multiple casualties, urgent surgical required." Sarah's pulse quickened as she listened to the coordinates. That was near where Alpha Company had been conducting their patrol. Her hands automatically began gathering supplies, muscle memory taking over as her mind calculated what she might need. Chest seals for sucking wounds. Tourniquets for severe bleeding. Morphine for pain management. The familiar dance of preparation that had become her daily routine. "I'm going with the bird," she announced to the other medics in the tent. "Sarah, you just came off a 12-hour shift," Corpsman Williams called out. "Let someone else take this one." She was already strapping on her gear, checking her aid bag one final time. "Alpha Company is out there. Those are my boys." The helicopter ride to the casualty site took only minutes, but it felt like hours. Sarah sat in the door, watching the Afghan landscape scroll beneath them, endless brown mountains and valleys that held so much beauty and so much danger. Her medical bag sat heavy on her lap, filled with everything she needed to keep someone alive long enough to reach proper surgical care. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset. "LZ is hot. We're taking some small arms fire from the ridgeline. Make this quick." Sarah's stomach tightened, but her hands remained steady. She had been in hot landing zones before. The key was to focus on the mission, on the wounded soldiers who needed her help. Everything else was just noise. The helicopter flared hard as it approached the landing zone, dust and debris swirling up around them in a brown cloud. Before the skids even touched the ground, Sarah was moving, her aid bag in one hand and a stretcher in the other. The crew chief pointed toward a cluster of rocks where she could see soldiers taking cover. "Over there." 3 wounded, 1 critical. Sarah sprinted across the open ground, her boots sliding in the loose sand. Bullets zinged overhead, but she barely registered the sound. Her entire focus was on reaching the wounded. This was what she had trained for, what she lived for, the moment when her skills could mean the difference between life and death. She found them huddled behind a pile of boulders, 2 soldiers working frantically to stop bleeding on a third. The wounded man was unconscious, his face pale beneath the dust and grime. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandages they had applied to his chest. "Talk to me," Sarah called out as she slid to her knees beside the casualty. Her hands were already moving, assessing the wound, checking vital signs. "Sniper got him in the chest," one of the soldiers reported. "Been bleeding for about 10 minutes. We tried to stop it, but..." "You did good," Sarah assured them, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. Her hands found the entry wound, a small hole just below the left shoulder blade. No exit wound, which meant the bullet was still inside, possibly near vital organs. She worked quickly but methodically, the way she had been trained. Pressure bandage to control external bleeding. Check the airway, clear. Pulse, weak but steady. Breathing, shallow but regular. The soldier was stable for now, but he needed surgery soon. "We need to move him," she announced. "Help me get him on the stretcher." As they carefully lifted the wounded man, Sarah caught sight of movement on the ridgeline above them. Muzzle flashes sparked among the rocks, and she heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire. The enemy was still up there, still shooting at them. "Contact left," one of the soldiers yelled. Sarah kept working, her hands never leaving her patient even as bullets struck the ground around them. This was her job, to heal, to save lives, to be the steady presence that soldiers could count on when everything else went to hell. Let others handle the fighting. Her war was fought with bandages and morphine, with gentle hands and whispered reassurances. The evacuation took longer than planned. More casualties came in, a soldier with a shattered leg, another with shrapnel wounds to the face and arms. Sarah moved between them like a dancer, her movements economical and precise. Each patient received exactly the care they needed, no more, no less. There wasn't time for anything else. By the time they loaded the last stretcher onto the helicopter, Sarah was exhausted but satisfied. 3 lives saved, 3 families that wouldn't receive the terrible knock on the door. This was why she had become a medic, for moments like this, when her skills and training could make a real difference. The flight back to base was quiet except for the monitoring of vital signs. Sarah sat beside her most critical patient, one hand on his pulse, the other ready to perform emergency procedures if his condition deteriorated. He was stable now, but head injuries were unpredictable. She had seen soldiers who seemed fine suddenly slip into comas, and others who appeared near death make miraculous recoveries. As the helicopter approached the landing pad at the base, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that they had made it back safely, anticipation for the handoff to the surgical team who would take over her patient's care. This was the hardest part for her, letting go, trusting others to continue the work she had started in the field. The surgical team was waiting as the helicopter touched down. Sarah gave her report quickly and efficiently, detailing each patient's injuries, the treatment she had provided, and their current status. The doctors and nurses took over smoothly, wheeling the stretchers toward the operating room where more advanced care awaited. "Nice work out there, Chen," Dr. Patterson called out as he hurried past. "Clean, professional, by the book." Sarah nodded her thanks but felt little satisfaction. She had done her job, nothing more. Tomorrow there would be another patrol, another call for medical assistance, another chance to use her skills to save lives. This was her purpose, her calling, to heal the wounds of war with gentle hands and a compassionate heart. She walked slowly back to the medical tent, her gear heavy on her shoulders. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving her feeling drained but oddly peaceful. Each successful mission reinforced her belief that she had chosen the right path. In a world filled with violence and destruction, she was a force for healing and hope. The other medics welcomed her back with tired smiles and cups of coffee that had been sitting too long on the hot plate. They didn't need to ask how it had gone, the fact that she was walking back instead of being carried told them everything they needed to know. 3 saves, she reported simply, settling into her chair and beginning the process of cleaning and restocking her medical supplies. "Outstanding," Williams replied. "You're becoming quite the legend around here." Sarah shook her head. just doing my job." But, even as she said it, she felt a flicker of pride. She was good at what she did, and, more importantly, what she did mattered. Every life saved was a victory against the senseless waste of war. Every wound healed was a small act of defiance against the forces of destruction that seemed to dominate this place. As the sun set over the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah continued her work. There were supplies to organize, medications to check, reports to write. The quiet routine of military medicine, punctuated by moments of intense action when lives hung in the balance. She thought about the wounded soldier she had treated today, probably lying in post-operative recovery now, alive because she had been there to help him. Tomorrow he might be calling her doc and grinning that grateful smile she had seen so many times before. The thought warmed her heart and reminded her why she had chosen this difficult but rewarding path. Her hands, she reflected as she organized bandages, were meant to heal. That had always been her truth, her North Star in the chaos of war. Let others carry rifles and fight the enemy with bullets and bombs. She would fight with different weapons, skill, knowledge, compassion, and the unwavering belief that every life was worth saving. The medical tent grew quiet as the evening settled in. Sarah finished her inventory and prepared for another night of standby duty. Somewhere out there, soldiers were on patrol, moving through the darkness with their own weapons and their own missions. But, if any of them fell, if any of them needed help, she would be ready. Her hands would be steady. Her supplies would be organized. Her heart would be prepared to do whatever it took to bring them home safely. This was her war, fought not with violence but with healing, not with hatred but with love for her fellow soldiers. She had no idea that everything was about to change. 3 weeks after her successful mission to save the wounded soldiers, Sarah found herself settling into a rhythm that felt almost routine. The forward operating base had become her second home, a place where her skills were valued and her presence brought comfort to the men and women who served alongside her. Every morning brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to make a difference in someone's life. The Afghan winter was settling in, bringing cold nights and shorter days. The medical tent required additional heating, and Sarah found herself working longer hours to ensure that medications didn't freeze and that wounded soldiers received proper care despite the harsh conditions. Her hands, which had grown accustomed to the desert heat, now worked in bulky gloves that made delicate procedures more challenging. "Doc, you need to see this," called out Specialist Martinez, one of the younger soldiers who had recently been assigned to assist with medical duties. He was holding a letter, his face serious despite his usual cheerful demeanor. Sarah looked up from the medical supplies she was organizing. Martinez was a good kid from New Mexico, barely 20 years old, with dreams of becoming a paramedic when he returned home. She had taken him under her wing, teaching him basic field medicine and watching him develop into a competent assistant. "What is it?" she asked, noting the official seal on the envelope. Orders came through. "We're being moved forward, closer to the border. Command wants a medical team attached to the new outpost they're establishing." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Moving forward meant leaving the relative safety of the established base, leaving behind the surgical facilities and support staff that made her job possible. A forward outpost would be smaller, more isolated, and, inevitably, more dangerous. "When?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite her growing anxiety. "Next week. They want you specifically, along with Williams and myself. Apparently, your reputation has reached pretty high up the chain of command." Sarah nodded slowly, processing this information. She had known this day might come. Combat medics went where the soldiers went, and soldiers went where the mission demanded. Still, the thought of leaving behind everything familiar filled her with unease. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and training. Sarah worked with her team to pack and organize medical supplies for the forward deployment. They had to anticipate every possible medical emergency while keeping their load light enough to be mobile. Every piece of equipment had to be essential, every medication carefully rationed. "Remember," she told Martinez as they worked, "we won't have the luxury of a full medical facility. We'll be the only advanced medical care for miles around. That means we have to be ready for everything." "I understand, document. But what if we encounter something we can't handle?" Sarah paused in her packing. It was a good question, one that had been weighing on her mind as well. At the established base, she could stabilize patients and hand them off to surgeons within minutes. At the forward outpost, she might be the only thing standing between a wounded soldier and death. Then, we do our best with what we have, she said finally. We improvise, we adapt, and we never give up. Every life is worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the situation seems. The helicopter ride to the new outpost took them deep into territory that felt wild and untamed. Sarah watched through the window as they flew over valleys that had seen countless conflicts throughout history. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh way, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were flying into something darker than anything she had experienced before. The outpost itself was smaller than she had expected, just a cluster of temporary buildings surrounded by sandbags and razor wire. The landing zone was nothing more than a cleared patch of dirt marked with orange cones. As their helicopter approached, she could see soldiers taking defensive positions around the perimeter, their weapons trained on the surrounding hills. "Welcome to Forward Operating Base Thunder," the base commander, Major Williams, greeted them as they unloaded their equipment. He was a career soldier with gray hair and tired eyes that spoke of too many deployments and too many difficult decisions. "I hope you're ready for a different kind of war out here." Sarah looked around at their new home, noting the defensive positions and the nervous energy of the soldiers. This place felt different from the established base they had left behind. Here, the war seemed closer, more personal, more immediate. "We're ready, sir," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Good. Because intelligence suggests increased enemy activity in this sector. They don't like us being here, and they're likely to test our defenses soon." The medical facility at the outpost was basic, a reinforced bunker with just enough space for 2 operating tables and minimal equipment. Sarah spent her first day organizing the space, trying to create some semblance of the medical capability she was used to. It was like trying to perform surgery with a pocket knife and a flashlight. "This is going to be challenging," Williams observed as he helped her arrange supplies. "We'll make it work," Sarah replied, though privately she shared his concerns. The lack of proper surgical facilities meant that any serious injuries would require immediate evacuation, and the remote location made that evacuation more dangerous and time-consuming. That first week passed quietly, almost too quietly. Sarah found herself growing increasingly tense as the days wore on without incident. The soldiers at the outpost were professional and competent, but she could sense their nervousness. They were deep in enemy territory, far from support, dependent entirely on their own skills and the hope that help would arrive if things went wrong. She spent her time treating minor injuries and illnesses, twisted ankles, stomach bugs, the usual collection of small problems that plagued soldiers in the field. It was routine work, but she found herself constantly listening for the sound of gunfire, constantly preparing for the moment when routine would give way to chaos. "You seem jumpy," Martinez observed one afternoon as they restocked their medical supplies. "Just staying alert," Sarah replied. "Something feels off about this place." "The soldiers feel it too. They keep looking at the hills like they expect trouble." Sarah nodded. The hills around the outpost were perfect for ambushes, offering countless hiding places for enemy fighters. Every patrol that left the base disappeared into that maze of rocks and valleys, and every time they returned, she felt a moment of relief. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was conducting sick call when she heard the distant sound of gunfire echoing through the valleys. Not the rapid bursts of training exercises, but the irregular patterns of actual combat. She felt her pulse quicken as she listened, trying to determine the direction and intensity of the fight. "Contact report coming in," one of the radio operators called out. "Alpha team is engaged approximately 2 kilometers north of our position." Sarah immediately began preparing for casualties. She laid out trauma supplies, checked her medications, and briefed Martinez on emergency procedures. This was the part of her job she was most familiar with, the calm preparation before the storm of wounded soldiers and desperate medical interventions. But the casualties never came. After an hour of sporadic gunfire, the radio crackled with an all-clear message. Alpha team was returning to base with no injuries, having successfully repelled a small probe by enemy forces. "False alarm," Williams said with obvious relief. Sarah nodded, but she didn't share his relief. If anything, the incident had made her more nervous. The enemy was testing their defenses, learning their capabilities and weaknesses. The next encounter might not end so cleanly. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. The outpost felt different in the darkness, more vulnerable somehow. She lay in her narrow bunk, listening to the sound of sentries moving around the perimeter, the distant call of nightbirds, and the occasional crackle of radio traffic. Every sound seemed magnified, every shadow potentially threatening. She thought about her grandmother, who had worked as a nurse during World War II. The old woman had never talked much about her wartime experiences, but Sarah remembered the way her hands would sometimes shake when she thought no one was looking. At the time, Sarah hadn't understood what caused those tremors. Now, lying in the darkness of a forward outpost in Afghanistan, she was beginning to understand. The next morning brought troubling news. Intelligence reports indicated a significant buildup of enemy forces in the surrounding area. Command was considering whether to reinforce the outpost or withdraw the garrison entirely. For Sarah and her medical team, this meant being ready for anything: a major battle, a hasty evacuation, or something in between. "Doc, I need to ask you something," Major Williams said, finding her in the medical bunker later that morning. His expression was serious, and Sarah felt a flutter of apprehension. "Yes, sir? If things go bad here, and I mean really bad, are you prepared to do whatever it takes to protect your patients?" Sarah looked at him carefully, trying to understand what he was really asking. "I'm prepared to provide medical care under any circumstances, sir. That's not what I'm asking." Major Williams glanced around the bunker, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Combat medics carry weapons for a reason, Chen. If enemy forces overrun our position, if they threaten wounded soldiers under your care, are you prepared to use that weapon?" Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She looked down at the M9 pistol holstered at her hip, standard issue for combat medics, but something she had never seriously considered using. The weapon felt foreign and heavy, a reminder of a part of military service she had always managed to avoid. "Sir, my job is to save lives, not take them." "I understand that. And I respect it. But sometimes, in war, those two responsibilities can conflict. I need to know that if that moment comes, you'll be ready." Sarah nodded slowly, though she felt anything but ready. The pistol at her hip suddenly felt heavier, more present. She had qualified with it during training, had maintained it according to regulations, but had never imagined actually pointing it at another human being. "I'll do whatever is necessary to protect my patients," she said finally. Major Williams studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "I hope it doesn't come to that, document. But I needed to know where you stand." After he left, Sarah found herself staring at her hands. These hands that had saved so many lives, that had brought comfort and healing to wounded soldiers, could they take a life if necessary? The thought made her feel sick, but she couldn't shake the major's words. Sometimes, in war, responsibilities could conflict. That afternoon, she decided to visit the firing range that had been set up behind the outpost. It was time to become reacquainted with her weapon, to prepare for possibilities she hoped would never arise. Martinez accompanied her, equally uncomfortable with the idea but understanding the necessity. The pistol felt awkward in her hands at first, heavier than she remembered from basic training. Her first shots were wide of the target, her hands unsteady with tension and unfamiliarity. But, gradually, muscle memory returned, and her groupings improved. "You're getting better," Martinez observed as they loaded fresh magazines. "I don't want to get better at this," Sarah replied honestly. "But the major is right. We have responsibilities that might conflict." They spent an hour on the range, both of them becoming more comfortable with their weapons but neither finding any joy in the activity. For Sarah, each shot felt like a betrayal of everything she had sworn to uphold as a medic. Yet she understood the grim logic behind the major's request. That evening, as she cleaned her pistol in the medical bunker, Sarah reflected on how much her world had changed in just a few weeks. At the established base, she had been able to focus entirely on healing. Here, at this isolated outpost, the lines between healer and warrior were becoming increasingly blurred. She thought again about her grandmother's trembling hands, and wondered if the old woman had faced similar choices during her service in World War II. Had there been moments when the duty to heal conflicted with the duty to protect? Had she ever been forced to choose between saving a life and taking one? The radio crackled with evening reports from patrol units. All quiet, all normal, all returning safely to base. But Sarah knew that this quiet was temporary. Something was building in the valleys around their outpost, something that would test all of them in ways they weren't prepared for. She finished cleaning her weapon and holstered it, then returned to organizing medical supplies. Whatever came next, she would be ready to fulfill her primary mission, saving lives and bringing comfort to the wounded. But now, for the first time since joining the army, she understood that sometimes being a healer might require becoming something else entirely. The pistol at her hip felt heavier than ever, a reminder that war had a way of forcing people to become things they never thought they could be. Sarah Chen, who had devoted her life to healing, was about to discover just how much she was willing to sacrifice to protect the lives entrusted to her care. The attack came at dawn, as attacks often do. Sarah was checking on a soldier with a minor infection when the first mortar round exploded just outside the perimeter. The sound hit her like a physical blow, rattling her teeth and sending medical supplies cascading from the shelves. In the sudden ringing silence that followed, she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Incoming, someone screamed, and then the world erupted into chaos. Sarah threw herself over her patient as more rounds began falling around the outpost. The bunker shook with each explosion, dust raining down from the reinforced ceiling. Through the medical facility's narrow windows, she could see muzzle flashes sparkling from the surrounding hills like deadly fireworks. "Martinez," she called out, trying to spot her assistant in the chaos. "Get ready for casualties." The young specialist appeared at her side, his face pale but determined. Together, they began setting up triage areas, laying out trauma supplies, and preparing for the flood of wounded that they knew would soon arrive. This was what they had trained for, but training could never fully prepare someone for the real thing. The base's defensive positions erupted in return fire, rifles and machine guns chattering as soldiers engaged targets in the hills. Through the medical bunker's reinforced walls, Sarah could hear Major Williams shouting orders, coordinating the defense of their isolated outpost. The first casualties arrived within minutes, 2 soldiers from the eastern perimeter, both wounded by shrapnel from a mortar round that had landed too close to their position. Sarah moved between them with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the ongoing battle raging around them. "Punctured lung on this one," she called to Martinez, pointing to the soldier who was struggling to breathe. "Get me a chest seal and prepare for needle decompression." As she worked, Sarah could hear the battle intensifying outside. What had started as a probe was becoming a full-scale assault. The enemy had waited for the perfect moment to strike, catching the outpost at its most vulnerable hour when visibility was limited and the garrison was still shaking off sleep. "Doc, we need you at the north wall." A soldier appeared in the doorway, his uniform torn and bloody. "Sergeant Rodriguez is down." Sarah's heart lurched. Mike Rodriguez, the big Texan who had called her doc since the day they met. She finished stabilizing her current patient and grabbed her aid bag. "Martinez, hold down the fort. If more casualties come in, follow triage protocols." "Where are you going?" "To get Mike." Sarah sprinted across the compound, staying low as bullets whined overhead. The north wall was the outpost's weakest point, a hastily constructed barrier of sandbags and concrete blocks. She could see Rodriguez lying motionless behind the defensive position, blood pooling beneath his still form. She slid into cover beside him, immediately checking for vital signs. Pulse, weak but present. Breathing, shallow and irregular. Blood loss, significant but not immediately fatal. A sniper's bullet had caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him into the concrete wall behind him. "Mike! Can you hear me?" She worked quickly, applying pressure bandages and checking for additional wounds. Rodriguez's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive. "Doc? That you?" "Yeah, it's me." "You're going to be fine, but I need to get you back to the medical bunker." Can't feel my arm." Sarah's examination revealed nerve damage from the bullet's impact. Rodriguez would live, but his fighting days were likely over. She began preparing him for transport, all while bullets continued to crack overhead and explosions shook the ground around them. "Doc!" One of the soldiers manning the wall called out urgently. "They're massing for an assault on the east side. You need to get out of here now." Sarah looked toward the eastern perimeter and felt her blood turn to ice. Through the pre-dawn gloom, she could see figures moving among the rocks, dozens of them, armed with rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. The enemy had used the mortar barrage as cover to get close to the outpost's defenses. "Help me get him to safety," she called to the nearest soldiers. Together, they carried Rodriguez back across the compound under heavy fire. Every step felt like an eternity, every bullet that missed them a small miracle. By the time they reached the medical bunker, Sarah was breathing hard and her hands were shaking with adrenaline. Martinez met them at the entrance, his young face grim with determination. 3 more casualties came in while you were gone. 1 critical, 2 walking wounded. Sarah surveyed her makeshift hospital and felt overwhelmed for the first time since arriving at the outpost. 5 wounded soldiers, limited supplies, and a battle that showed no signs of ending soon. She would have to make decisions she had never wanted to make, prioritize lives in ways that went against everything she believed about medicine. Triage, she told Martinez. Most critical first, stabilize who we can, and prepare for more. She moved between her patients like a conductor directing a tragic orchestra, her hands working automatically while her mind calculated resources and probabilities. The soldier with the punctured lung needed immediate attention. Rodriguez required surgery that she couldn't provide. The others could wait, but for how long? Outside, the battle was reaching a crescendo. She could hear automatic weapons firing almost continuously now, punctuated by the explosive roar of grenades and the distinctive whistle of incoming mortars. The outpost's small garrison was fighting for its life against an enemy force that seemed determined to overrun their position. Doc! A soldier burst into the medical bunker, his rifle still smoking from recent use. Major Williams needs you at the command post. Now! Sarah looked up from the patient she was treating. I can't leave. I have wounded soldiers who need immediate care. He says it's urgent. Something about evacuation. Sarah's heart sank. Evacuation meant the situation was critical, that the outpost might not be able to hold. But it also meant hope, the possibility of getting her patients to proper medical facilities where they could receive the care she couldn't provide. Martinez, take over. Follow the treatment protocols we discussed. I'll be back as soon as possible. She ran through the compound to the command bunker, noting the damage from the ongoing assault. Several buildings had taken direct hits from mortars, and she could see bodies lying motionless in defensive positions. The outpost was being systematically destroyed around them. Major Williams was hunched over a radio when she arrived, his face drawn with exhaustion and stress. Maps covered the table in front of him, marked with red circles indicating enemy positions. Doc, thank God you're here. We've got a problem. Sir? Medevac helicopter took small arms fire on approach. They can't land with the LZ under direct observation from enemy positions. We need to clear those hills if we want to get your patients out of here. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. What are you asking me to do, sir? I'm not asking, document. I'm telling you. We're down to 30% strength. Every able-bodied soldier is needed on the line. That includes combat medics. Sarah stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. Sir, I have 5 critically wounded soldiers who need immediate medical attention. I can't abandon them to fight. You won't be abandoning them. Martinez can handle basic care for the time it takes us to clear those positions. But, right now, we need every rifle we can get, or none of us are walking out of here. The Major's words hit her like a physical blow. He was asking her to choose between her duty as a healer and her duty as a soldier. After years of believing those roles were complementary, she was discovering that sometimes they were directly opposed. I'm not a soldier, sir. I'm a medic. Right now, Doc, you're whatever we need you to be. And what we need is someone who can shoot straight and follow orders. Sarah thought about her patients lying wounded in the medical bunker. Rodriguez with his damaged shoulder. The soldier with the punctured lung who might not survive without constant monitoring. The others who were counting on her to keep them alive until real help arrived. But she also thought about the enemy fighters in the hills, the ones who were preventing the helicopter from landing. If those positions weren't cleared, no one would survive, not her patients, not the remaining soldiers, not herself. How long? She asked quietly. 30 minutes, maybe less. We hit them hard and fast, drive them back from the LZ, and get that bird in here. Sarah closed her eyes and made the hardest decision of her life. Martinez will need detailed instructions for each patient. You'll have 5 minutes to brief him. She ran back to the medical bunker, her mind reeling with the enormity of what she was about to do. Martinez looked up as she entered, his hands bloody from treating the wounded. What did the Major want? I have to go, she said simply. You're in charge of the medical facility. Martinez's face went white. What do you mean you have to go? The helicopter can't land because of enemy positions in the hills. They need every available soldier to clear those positions. Including me. But, Doc, you're a medic. You don't fight. Sarah looked at her hands, still stained with blood from treating wounded soldiers. Apparently, today I do. She spent the next few minutes briefing Martinez on each patient's condition and treatment requirements. The young soldier listened intently, asking questions and taking notes, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He was being asked to take responsibility for lives he wasn't fully trained to save. You can do this, she told him as she prepared to leave. Trust your training, follow the protocols, and don't take unnecessary risks. I'll be back as soon as possible. Doc, wait. Martinez grabbed her arm as she headed for the exit. What if something happens to you? What if you don't come back? Sarah paused at the threshold of the bunker, looking back at her patients and the young soldier who would now be responsible for their lives. Then, you keep them alive until someone who can help arrives. That's what medics do. She walked out of the medical bunker and toward the armory, where Major Williams was distributing weapons and ammunition to the makeshift assault team. Her hands felt strange and foreign as she accepted an M4 rifle and loaded magazines. This weapon, designed for killing, felt completely different from the medical instruments she was used to handling. You remember your rifle training? The major asked as he checked her equipment. Yes, sir. But, it's been a while since I've had to use it. It's like riding a bicycle. Muscle memory will take over once the shooting starts. Sarah hoped he was right, though she wasn't sure she wanted the muscle memory to return. Every bullet she fired would take her further away from everything she had believed about herself and her role in the military. The assault team consisted of 8 soldiers, including herself, all that could be spared from defending the outpost. Their mission was simple: advance up the hillside, eliminate enemy positions overlooking the landing zone, and hold those positions long enough for the helicopter to extract the wounded. Remember, Major Williams briefed them, we're not trying to win the war here. We just need to create a window for the medevac. Hit hard, hit fast, and get back to the perimeter. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the outpost, Sarah took one last look back at the medical bunker. Through the narrow windows, she could see Martinez moving between the patients, following the procedures she had taught him. The sight filled her with both pride and terror. Let's move, the major commanded. Sarah shouldered her rifle and followed the team out into the Afghan dawn, leaving behind everything she had ever believed about herself. In her mind, she could hear the mocking voices that had plagued her throughout her military career: medics don't fight. Medics aren't soldiers. Medics save lives, they don't take them. But, as they advanced toward the enemy positions, with wounded soldiers depending on her to clear the way for their evacuation, Sarah realized that sometimes the line between healer and warrior wasn't as clear as she had always believed. Sometimes, saving lives required taking them. The rifle in her hands felt heavier with each step, but her resolve grew stronger. She was still a medic, still a healer, still someone who believed that every life was precious. But, today, she would also be something else, whatever it took to bring her patients home safely. The climb up the hillside felt like the longest journey of Sarah's life. Each step took her further from the medical bunker where her patients lay wounded and deeper into territory where healing hands would need to hold instruments of war. The M4 rifle in her grip felt alien, its weight distributed so differently from the medical equipment she was used to carrying. The assault team moved in tactical formation, using available cover as they advanced toward the enemy positions. Sarah found herself falling back on training she had hoped never to use, her body remembering movements and procedures from basic military instruction. But this wasn't a training exercise where blanks were fired and casualties were simulated. This was real, with real consequences for failure. Contact front, one of the soldiers called out. Muzzle flashes erupted from a cluster of rocks about 50 meters ahead. Sarah threw herself behind a boulder as bullets cracked overhead, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound of gunfire was different when you were the target, sharper, more personal, carrying the weight of lethal intent. Shun! Can you see the shooter in the rocks at 2 o'clock? Major Williams called out. Sarah peered around her cover, scanning the rocky outcropping for signs of movement. There, a brief glimpse of a rifle barrel, a shadow that moved differently from the morning light. Her training kicked in, muscle memory from countless hours on shooting ranges taking control of her actions. She raised her rifle, aligned the sights, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil surprised her, even though she had expected it. The sound of her rifle firing mixed with the ongoing battle, but she felt the shot as something separate, something that marked a fundamental change in who she was. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "Good shot," Williams called out. "Target down." Sarah stared at the rocks where she had aimed, trying to process what she had just done. Somewhere in those shadows was a human being who would never go home, never see family again, never laugh or cry or dream about the future. And she had been the one to end all of that. But even as the weight of that realization settled on her, she heard something else, the sound of the medevac helicopter approaching from the south. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio, reporting that the landing zone was still taking fire from enemy positions higher up the slope. "We've got to keep moving," Williams commanded. "That bird can't wait around forever." The assault team continued their advance, leapfrogging from cover to cover as they worked their way up the hillside. Sarah found herself operating on autopilot, her conscious mind struggling to reconcile what she was doing with everything she had believed about herself. But, beneath the moral confusion, her training and instincts had taken over. They encountered 2 more enemy positions on their way to the ridgeline, each engagement brief but intense. Sarah fired her rifle when targets appeared, following the same principles of accuracy and discipline that guided her medical procedures. Aim carefully, control your breathing, squeeze the trigger smoothly, assess the result. With each shot, she felt another piece of her old identity slip away. Sarah Chen, the dedicated healer who had never wanted to harm anyone, was disappearing into someone else, someone who could kill when necessary, who could prioritize the mission over personal beliefs. "Final position ahead," Williams announced as they approached the crest of the hill. "Intelligence says there's a heavy machine gun position overlooking the LZ. That's what's keeping our bird from landing." Sarah could see it now, a well-constructed fighting position carved into the rocks, with interlocking fields of fire that covered the outpost's landing zone. Even from their elevated position, she could see muzzle flashes as the enemy gunners engaged targets below. "We need to take that position," Williams continued. "But it's going to require a frontal assault. No way to flank it from here." Sarah studied the enemy position, her medic's eye automatically assessing the tactical situation. The machine gun nest was well protected, with natural rock barriers that would stop most small arms fire. But she could see a weakness, a narrow gap in the rocks that would allow someone to get close enough to use grenades. "Sir," she called out, "I can see a way to get close to their position." Williams followed her pointing finger, then shook his head. "Too dangerous. That approach is completely exposed. Whoever tries it won't make it halfway." "Unless they're distracted," Sarah replied. "If the rest of the team lays down covering fire from here, I can use that gap to get within grenade range." "Absolutely not. I'm not sending a medic on a suicide mission." Sarah felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "Sir, with respect, I'm not just a medic right now. I'm a soldier, and soldiers do what's necessary to complete the mission." Williams studied her face, perhaps seeing something there that he hadn't expected. "Chen, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." "You've already done more than those are my patients down there," Sarah interrupted. "Rodriguez and the others. They're depending on us to clear this LZ so they can get the care they need. I'm not going to let them down." The major was quiet for a moment, weighing the risks against the potential gains. Finally, he nodded grimly. 60 seconds of covering fire, starting on my signal. You get one chance at this." Sarah checked her grenades and adjusted her grip on the rifle. The gap in the rocks looked impossibly narrow from here, a thread of space between walls of stone that offered minimal concealment. But it was the only way to reach the machine gun position, and reaching that position was the only way to save her patients. "Ready," she called out. "Covering fire, now." The hillside erupted in gunfire as the assault team opened up on the enemy position. Sarah sprinted from cover, running across open ground toward the gap in the rocks. Bullets buzzed around her like angry insects, some coming close enough that she could feel their passage through the air. She reached the gap and pressed herself against the rock wall, breathing hard but alive. From this position, she could hear the enemy fighters talking to each other in urgent tones, could smell the cordite from their weapons, could feel the vibration through the stone each time their machine gun fired. Sarah pulled the pin from a grenade, counted to 3, and threw it around the rocky outcropping into the machine gun nest. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, followed immediately by screams and the sound of falling rocks. Sarah waited a moment, then peered around the corner to assess the damage. The machine gun position was destroyed, its crew killed or scattered by the blast. More importantly, the landing zone was now clear of the heavy weapons fire that had been preventing the helicopter from landing. "LZ is clear," she called out over the radio. "Bring in that bird." The sound of the helicopter grew louder as it approached the outpost below. Sarah could see it now, a black speck against the morning sky that represented hope and salvation for her wounded patients. But, even as she watched it descend toward the landing zone, she knew that something fundamental had changed in her forever. She had killed people today. Multiple people, in fact, though she couldn't bring herself to count exactly how many. Each pull of the trigger, each thrown grenade, each life ended had taken her further from the person she had been and closer to someone she wasn't sure she wanted to become. "Outstanding work, Chen," Major Williams called out as the assault team regrouped at the destroyed machine gun position. "That was some of the finest soldiering I've ever seen." Sarah nodded her acknowledgement, but the praise felt hollow. She had accomplished the mission, cleared the landing zone, and saved her patients. But the cost of that success would stay with her forever. They made their way back down the hillside more slowly than they had climbed it, checking for remaining enemy fighters and securing the route for future operations. Sarah's rifle felt different now, not foreign anymore, but not comfortable either. It was a tool she had learned to use, but one that she hoped never to need again. Back at the outpost, the medevac helicopter was just lifting off with the wounded soldiers aboard. Sarah watched it disappear into the distance, carrying Rodriguez and the others to medical facilities where they could receive proper care. The mission was complete, the objective achieved, the lives saved. Martinez met her at the entrance to the medical bunker, his young face bright with relief and excitement. "Doc! You did it! The helicopter got everyone out safely. How are they?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from the successful evacuation. "Stable. All of them. Your initial treatment was exactly what they needed to survive until the surgeons could take over." Sarah felt a warm glow of satisfaction at that news, the first positive emotion she had experienced since taking up the rifle. Her patients were safe, receiving the care they needed, alive because she had done her job as both medic and soldier. "Doc," Martinez continued, his voice dropping to a more serious tone, "what you did up there, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah looked at her hands, still grimy from climbing rocks and handling weapons. They were the same hands that had saved countless lives, that had brought comfort to the wounded and dying. Now they had also taken lives, ended stories that would never reach their natural conclusions. "I did what was necessary," she said simply. "The other soldiers are calling you a hero. They're saying you single-handedly cleared the LZ and saved everyone's lives." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not a hero, Martinez. I'm just a medic who learned that sometimes healing requires fighting." That evening, as the outpost settled into defensive positions for the night, Sarah found herself back in the medical bunker, reorganizing supplies and preparing for future casualties. The familiar routine was comforting after the chaos of the day, a return to the world she understood and felt comfortable inhabiting. But she couldn't shake the memory of the weight of the rifle in her hands, the sound of gunfire, the knowledge that she had crossed a line she had never wanted to cross. The pistol at her hip, which had felt so foreign just weeks ago, now seemed like a natural part of her equipment. Major Williams found her there as she worked, his expression thoughtful and somewhat sad. "How are you holding up, Doc?" Sarah paused in her inventory to consider the question. "I'm not sure yet, sir. Ask me again in a few days. What you did today saved lives. Not just the wounded soldiers in this bunker, but probably everyone at this outpost. If that LZ hadn't been cleared. I understand the tactical situation, sir. And I understand why it was necessary." Williams nodded slowly. "But understanding and accepting aren't the same thing, are they?" "No, sir. They're not. For what it's worth, Chen, I think you handled an impossible situation with grace and courage. You should be proud of what you accomplished." Sarah resumed organizing medical supplies, her hands moving automatically through familiar tasks. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Of course." Do you think it's possible to be both a healer and a warrior? Or does becoming one mean giving up the other? Major Williams was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. I think, Doc, that sometimes the greatest act of healing is preventing greater harm. You saved lives today, not just with medical treatment, but by fighting for the ability to provide that treatment. After he left, Sarah continued working in the quiet solitude of the medical bunker. Her patients were safe now, receiving proper surgical care at facilities with resources she could only dream of. The outpost was secure, its perimeter re-established and its defensive positions reinforced. But the real battle, Sarah realized, wasn't over. The hardest fight would be learning to live with the choices she had made, to reconcile the person she had been with the person she had become. She was still a healer, that fundamental truth hadn't changed. But now she was also something else, something more complex and harder to define. She thought about the enemy fighters she had killed, wondering about their stories, their families, their dreams cut short by her actions. They had been human beings with lives and hopes, just as her patients were human beings deserving of care and protection. The moral weight of that knowledge would stay with her forever, she knew. Every life saved would be measured against every life taken, an equation that would never balance perfectly in her mind. But, as she prepared the medical facility for whatever tomorrow might bring, Sarah realized something important: being a warrior hadn't made her less of a healer. If anything, it had made her understand the true cost of healing in a world where violence and suffering seemed endless. Her hands, which had learned to kill when necessary, were still primarily instruments of healing. They would continue to save lives, to bring comfort to the wounded, to fight against death and suffering in all their forms. The rifle might be part of her equipment now, but the stethoscope was still the tool she reached for first. The pistol at her hip was a last resort, not a first choice. She was still Sarah Chen, combat medic, dedicated to saving lives and serving others. She was just a more complete version of that person now, someone who understood that in war, the line between healer and warrior was often thinner than anyone wanted to admit. As she settled in for another night of standby duty, listening for the radio calls that might summon her to save lives, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would never forget what it had cost to become both healer and warrior. She would carry that weight with her always, a reminder of the price of survival in a world where good people sometimes had to do terrible things. But she would also never forget why she had made those choices: to protect the wounded, to save lives, to ensure that soldiers like Rodriguez could go home to their families. In the end, that purpose would sustain her through whatever darkness lay ahead. The medic who had once believed that hands were meant only to heal had learned that sometimes, those same hands had to fight for the right to heal at all. It was a harder truth than she had ever wanted to face, but it was her truth now. And she would live with it, one patient at a time, for as long as her service required.